Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So let's get started. So hello everyone, and nice to see you all. And I can recognize some of your faces. And hello Shirley, I can see you down there. And we're going to talk about a little bit about the idea of independence. I know it is Independence Day in the US, and I don't really know all that much about Independence Day. I was telling Ayatollah before, I don't really know much about it, but and then she wrote very kindly to me, she wrote a wrong email to tell me about what people do in the US on Independence Day and all these kind of things. And then I realized that US Independence Day is just like Independence Day everywhere. Yeah, we have the same thing in Norway. We have the same thing pretty much in every country around the world. And you kind of, you hoist your flags and you chant the national anthem and you kind of have parades and all these kind of things. It's basically the same thing everywhere. So, and that is I think, an important part of life, the idea of the search for independence. Independence is very much what we look for in our worldly life. Yeah, we look for a sense of freedom from oppression and freedom from problems and freedom from suffering, of course. That is in our worldly life, but also in our spiritual life. Also, it's very much about independence. And independence in the spiritual life means to be independent primarily from the problems of the world, the oppressions in your own mind, and also, of course, the oppression of suffering itself. So these are two sides of the same coin, and we need a degree of independence in the world to be able to pursue the inner path of independence in our own minds. External independence is to some extent required. So it's probably a good thing that the US kind of rebelled a little bit against the British in, what was it, 1776, is that right? Something like that. And because it allows you to express some of that, separation and not being tyrannized and oppressed by a foreign power. And I think this is very, very important. And if you look around at certain societies in the world, you can see that there are certain societies where it is very difficult to have an independent opinion about anything. And if you do express your independent opinions in certain societies and places, it has very bad ramifications for you. It has very negative consequences. In fact, we have a man right here at Bodhinana Monastery right now who is originally a Pakistani national. But when he told his Pakistani friends that he was a Buddhist, he actually had to flee the country because it was not acceptable in Pakistan to be a Buddhist. And that is how it can be sometimes. So we should be very grateful for having a degree of independence in our societies. And it then creates a foundation for our Buddhist practice and all of these kind of things. But what has also been very interesting to watch from Australia and to watch around the world has been all the goings on in the US. Yeah, I've been watching recently the kind of what's going on with the Black Lives Matters and the oppression, that the police brutality and all of these kind of things. And of course, this is not just an American problem, this is an international problem. These are things that we find everywhere. And that too, in many ways, is an expression of the search for independence, the search for getting away from oppression, the search for a life that is less, we're less downtrodden and less, we have less suffering in our world. And that, of course, that search must always go on. And it's important that we have that ability to do that in our societies. But there is also, sometimes we need to find a balance, however. We need to know what is the right way to go about these things. If we go about the search for independence in the wrong way, then I think sometimes we create more problems. So what I would just talk about very briefly before I get on to the more deeper sides of the idea of independence is how do we find the right balance in a situation like we have in the US now, where you have a lot of opposition between different groups, different groups kind of clashing with each other. How can we do this in a way where we don't just create disharmony, but we create harmony, a sense of empathy and sympathy for each other, while at the same time moving towards a society which is more just and where there is less oppression. And one of the kind of one of the things that have been happening a lot around the world is the idea of special groups coming together, forming kind of groups, and then advancing their cause within that group. And sometimes this is called identity politics, whereby you kind of form subgroups and these kind of things. And sometimes that is fine, and sometimes it is necessary. But from a Buddhist point of view, the idea of identity is often a problematic one. Because as soon as you identify with a certain group, as soon as that becomes who you are, then you are also creating an other at the same time. There is an us and there is a them. And as soon as you have an us and you have a them, then you have a recipe for conflict, for oppression, for violence ultimately, and eventually for wars and all the kind of big problems that we have in our society. So the idea of having too strong an identity can often be problematic. The more you have of that, then often it leads down the wrong track. So how can we deal with this from a Buddhist point of view? And one of the ways that I have always liked to think about it, sometimes I give talks about human rights, for example, at the local university here in Perth, and it's a wonderful privilege to be able to do that. And one of the things I like to bring out, of course, when I talk about human rights, I like to talk about the Buddhist approach to these things. What does Buddhism have to add to the idea of human rights? And one of the points that I like to make is that we are always changing as human beings. If you try to find a core, if you try to find out who you really are, you can keep on looking at. And there is no ultimate identity within us. There's no final person that we actually are, because we're always changing, always moving around. Sometimes we may have a high social status, and then our social status may decline. Sometimes it may be the other way around. Sometimes we may be reasonably wealthy, then we go from wealthy to poor. Sometimes these days people change their gender. You go from male to female or female to male, and these things are happening. So you can start to get a feeling for how malleable our identity actually is, and how little core there is within each of us, and how things always change. And sometimes they change far more than we're even able to comprehend. And of course, the Buddhists take this far, far beyond this, because in Buddhism, we also move sometimes from one life to another one. And when you move from one life to another one, then that is an opportunity for who you are as a person to change far more dramatically. You can move from being one race to another one culture to another one gender to another one. Almost anything is possible when you take rebirth into account. And one of the interesting things that I have sometimes thought in my own life is that for me, it was actually very easy to become a Buddhist monk. It may sound strange, but for me, it almost like it's happened automatically. You wonder, it's kind of it's very strange. Most people cannot, even the idea of becoming a monastic is very strange. But for me, it was almost like, bang, it just happened. And the more I think about it, the more sure I am that I must have been a monastic in a past life. Some of the things that happened to me when I was young, when I was a child in my teenage years, some of the fantasies I had about living in a small hut in the forest by myself. When I was 12 years old, I had a fantasy about living in a little hut in the forest by myself. And where does that come from? It's very hard to really, understand where these things come from. But ultimately, I came to the conclusion I must have been a monastic in a past life. And if I was a monastic in a past life, well, where was that? Well, it would have to be somewhere in Asia. There was no monasticism in Europe or in the West at that time at all. So it must have been in Asia somewhere. So probably, if I think of myself, I think it's very likely that I was a monk. Maybe I was a nun. Sometimes I think it's quite possible I was a nun, in some country in Asia, maybe in Sri Lanka, maybe in China, maybe in who knows where. It's very hard to pin down. And so straight away, I get this feeling that all of these nationalities, all the genders, they are already inside of me. They're already part of who I am as a person. And of course, then you can extend that and you start to realize that not just being a an Asian or being the other gender or whatever, but actually any position of a human being in this world is very likely. I have been in that position myself in the past. So when I think like that, it kind of brings everybody on board. It brings everybody together. It makes me able to sympathize with other people and empathize with others in far more powerful way here, because I understand that that also is inside of me here. And if I carry on living in a life after this one again in the future, again, I will have to go into similar kind of existences in the future as well. Layperson, monastic, male, female, educated, uneducated, intelligent, not so intelligent, one skin color to another skin color, one culture to another culture, moving around endlessly. It's all there inside of us. So how then can we not treat other people with empathy? If you discriminate against someone else, if you oppress someone else, the person you are really oppressing is yourself. And that is really the powerful message. You're oppressing yourself because these things are already inside of you. And if we use this Buddhist idea, we can let go of some of the more negative consequences of identity. We can take everybody on board. We can understand the humanity of everyone around us to some extent. May not be able to understand them 100% because there are differences, of course, but at least we can understand a very large part of what it is to be human in any kind of situation around the world. And what a wonderful thing. And then I think actually there is some opportunity to have more harmony in our society here. And hopefully we can move forward with more compassion, more sympathy, and more understanding for each other. So that is kind of my little Buddhist commentary on what is happening in the United States, and not only there, but around the world, trying to have more understanding for each other. And this is only one way of doing that. But I want to move on a little bit because time is quite short. And I want to talk a little bit more about the spiritual side of independence, and not just focus on the worldly things, but because it is Independence Day, I thought I would have to start out with the worldly side a little bit. So on the spiritual side, of course, it becomes even far more powerful, because here we're talking about an inner independence, an independence of the mind. And that is where real freedom, real independence is found, according to the Buddhist teachings. And one of the things that come to mind is a teaching that was given by Ajahn. I'm sure many of you will have heard about Ajahn Chah, one of the most famous meditation masters in Thailand in the 20th century. And he gave a very beautiful teaching about the idea of independence. And what he said, he gave a simile, the simile of the crab, the mother crab. And he said, this mother crab, she had one bad leg. Yeah, and because she had one bad leg, this mother crab, she was limping around. But then all the baby crabs, all her little children or baby little crabs, because they saw their mother limping around, they too started limping around. Even though they were perfectly healthy, all their legs were okay, they were just following along according to their mothers. My mom is limping, surely that must mean that we must limp as well. But does that make any sense? That doesn't make any sense, right? Just because your mother is limping, because she has a bad leg, you are still supposed to walk properly here. And Ajahn Chah apparently used this idea to make the point that very often we are not independent enough in the way we think about the world, in the way we deal even with monastic life or Buddhism. Sometimes we need to take a step back. We need to ask where our teachers perhaps even went wrong. But even if it didn't go wrong, we need to ask, how should we deal with life in our society? What does Buddhism mean in our society, in our time, and not just take on board blindly things from the past? And this is fascinating. Very often you think that someone like Ajahn Chah, who comes from a Thai culture, he will be very interested in bringing the Thai culture and Thai ideas of Buddhism forward and bringing that to the West or whatever. But no, the people who have real powerful spiritual insight, they understand the importance of independence. of doing things in your own way, of reacting to the social conditions in your society, so you can do something with that and deal with that in the right way. Because if you don't, you're letting Buddhism down. Yeah, we start limping also with and we only have, crabs have many legs. We only have 2 legs. It's really bad news if we start limping, only got 1 good leg. Yeah, then it kind of really messing things up. And this is the problem with limping through Buddhism, limping through reality. Basically means that we're not doing the best that we can with these Buddhist teachings in our situation, our society. So it becomes very important to be independent to some extent. Of course, it's tricky because we need to know when to be independent. We need to know when to take on board the teachings properly. What are the essential things that we need to carry on, and what are the superficial cultural accretions that we don't have to take so seriously. And that distinction is very, very important to make. But after a while, once you start to get the hang of these Buddhist teachings, you start to be able to pull these things apart and actually make that distinction for yourself. And I was recently, and only actually not that recently now, because of all the COVID situation, I haven't really traveled anywhere for 4 months or something. And that's very unusual for me. Usually I travel way too much. It's actually far better to travel on Zoom. And so I'm really happy to be able to travel all the way to, most of you are in the US, very nice to travel all the way to the US via Zoom. It's very handy. But before this COVID situation started, I was in Thailand and I visited one of the very famous Thai meditation monks. He's a monk called Ajahn, and he was the nephew of Ajahn Chah. And many people, he's a very, very impressive monk. He's one of these people, when you come into his presence, you feel that there's something different about this person. You feel there is a sense of kindness, a sense of profundity, a sense of peace, a sense of wisdom there, which is just out of this world. It is so unusual when you meet people like this. And he's one of these very exceptional people. And I came to his place and I paid my respects to him. And when you are a monk, especially if you are a monk from Ajahn Brahma's monastery, he really looks after you. So he looked after me like I was his only son or something like that. He took me around everywhere. He was very sweet and very beautiful the way he kind of looked after me, but also not just me, other people too, who are monastics. He often looks after them in a very, very nice way. And because I am a Westerner, I'm very kind of naughty. Yeah, I like to ask tricky questions, even of the most famous monks. I don't really hold back very much. And very often they appreciate that. Yeah, they like it when they get challenged, because very often in traditional Asian societies, you're not supposed to challenge the teacher. Yeah, but as a Westerner, that comes quite naturally. Yeah, that's kind of part and parcel of how we're brought up. You're allowed to ask questions, you're allowed to do things. So you kind of do that, not in a bad way, in a respectful way, but just still being more open about things. And so I asked him a little bit about the ordination of bhikkhunis in the West. Yeah, remember, this is one of the most famous monks in Thailand. Yeah, he is regarded by many people as being enlightened, probably, by many people. It's hard to know these things for sure, but you know what it's like when you meet someone like that. So I asked him about bhikkhuni ordination in the West. Now remember, he is the nephew of Ajahn Chah. Yeah, he stayed at many years at Wat Pha Pong with Ajahn Chah. Yeah, so this is kind of going to the core here of the entire Ajahn Chah tradition in many ways. So I asked him, what do you think about this? And he replied that in the West, you need to do things in a different way. Western society is not like Thai society. You need to look at the requirements in the West, what actually will make Buddhism flourish in the Western world, and you have to act accordingly. If you just take on board the Thai way of doing things in the West, you're not being silly. You're not being wise. You need to take the core, the essence of the Buddhist teachings, and then carry that on in the Western world. And it was such a beautiful thing to hear that. Yeah, I mean, obviously, Ajahn Ganha is a very close friend of Ajahn Brahm and all of that. So I sort of expected him to be positive, but still, he went out of his way to be positive about this. Went out of his way to tell us to be independent, to do things differently. And that was a very, very powerful message from a monk like that. But what actually happened, just to come back a little bit to this idea of ordaining, or the bhikkhunis being ordained. And of course, we had our ordination of bhikkhunis. We had many, many here in Perth over the years. But the first one we had was in 2009. And that's when Aya Tataloka, she's probably there in the background, so I can't see her, but she's probably there. And she came all the way to Perth to act as the Pavatani, the preceptor of these nuns that we were ordaining in Perth. And that was a wonderful, kind gesture to come all the way to Australia for that purpose. And it was a very interesting time because it was obviously quite controversial. And so I was talking to Ajahn Brahm almost all the time to discuss the pros and cons and whether we should do it or not and all of these kind of things. And of course, we went through with the ordination. And a few days after the ordination ceremony, Ajahn Brahm was essentially asked to come to Thailand. Yeah, come to Thailand, come to Wat Pah Pong, and to discuss what actually happened there. So he went there, and it was a very kind of very strong meeting. You can imagine, you know, all of these very senior monks, many of them been monks for 30, 40 years, a large group of monks. And all of these monks were on one side, and Ajahn Brahm was the one monk on the other side. Yeah, you can imagine what that feels like. It makes you feel a bit lonely, perhaps. Yeah, when you are the only one. It's like, help! No one out there to help me here. And that was perhaps what I don't know what Ajahn Brahm felt like. I didn't really ask him, but it must have been a bit lonely. There was actually one man there. There was an Australian man, a lay person from Perth, who accompanied Ajahn Brahm. And he told me about the feeling of the meeting afterwards. And he said it was kind of very powerful and very strong with so many monks, yeah, on one side and Ajahn Brahm on the other side. And what happened at that meeting was that, I'm not going to go into great detail, but one of the things that was said was that because the ordination of bhikkhunis was not really acceptable at Wat Pah Pong at that time, they had decided for their own reason it wasn't really right. They said to Ajahn Brahm, well, either you have to relinquish that ordination of bhikkhunis, or you're going to have to leave Wat Pah Pong, that group of monastics and monasteries there. And you can imagine the pressure on Ajahn Brahm, yeah, when that happened. And so Ajahn Brahm told me that, well, what I thought at that point was that when you have done a thing like an ordination ceremony, it is called the Sangha Kamma, an action of the Sangha. When you have done that, you can't rescind it. You can't just take it back personally. It's not up to Ajahn Brahm to rescind the Sangha Kamma. If an action has done by the Sangha in the right way, then it stands. You can't rescind it. So Ajahn Brahm said, no, sorry, they are ordained. There's nothing I can do about that now. And of course, once that happened, then of course, that was the end. And that is how Bodhinyana Monastery ended up outside of that Wat Pah Pong system. And then Ajahn Brahm came back to Perth, and I discussed it with him. I asked him about what happened in Thailand. And Ajahn Brahm told me that there was only, for him, there was only one thing to do in this kind of situation. And that was to ask himself, did I do anything wrong? That's what Ajahn Brahm asked himself. Did I do anything wrong in this situation? Did I come from the wrong place? Did I act out of desire? Did I act out of ill will or delusion or any of those things? And Ajahn Brahm told me that when he looked into himself in this way, he said, I could not see that I acted out of any kind of defilements. And when I knew that I hadn't acted out of defilements, that I acted out of compassion and care and kindness for the world, and I knew I had done the right thing. And that was the end of the story. And the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because this gives you an idea of what independence is about in the world, the idea of being able and having the courage to do things differently. Yeah? There's only one thing that we need to ask. Are we coming from the right place? Are we acting with care and compassion? And if we are, then we know we can never really go all that wrong, because we're doing things in the way that the Buddha said we should be doing things. We're acting in a moral way, and we're also acting, in this case, in a way that enables Buddhism to be sustained in the West in the long run. To me, it is absolutely fundamental that we have bhikkhunis. The idea that we should not have this in the Western world, to me, is recipe for diminishing Buddhism and for destroying its potential and for not allowing it to flourish to the best possibility. So it is so important, and for that reason, I have no doubt that that is the right way to go for the future of Buddhism and for the future of all the positive things that we see with that. So that is just to give you one idea what independence means. Yeah? And Ajahn Brahm has this extraordinary ability to be very independent. Even though all his friends in Thailand, all his Western friends, almost anyone that he knew in Buddhism, everyone rejected him. He said, no, I'm going to do what is right. It doesn't matter what the entire world thinks. If I know it's right, then I'm going to have to do it. And that is what independence looks like sometimes. So that is just to give you an idea of what it looks like, when you have practiced the path a long way. And of course, Ajahn Brahm has practiced for 45 years as a monastic, and that gives him a certain profundity, an ability to withstand the currents of the world and do things in your own way. But I want to go a bit further on what independence means in a more personal way. What does it mean in terms of us and how we live our spiritual life in particular? And I'm going to tell you one short little story. This is from my own life. And this is when my father died about just over a year ago. And then my sister died a few months after that. And it was a bit of a shock to the family. 2 people dying in the family in such a fairly short course of time is very, it's interesting to see your reactions to that, because you think that as a monastic, you will withstand these things. You won't be so, taken by someone dying, even if they are your closest family members. So it was a very interesting time for me when these things happened. And I, of course, being a monastic, I realized a long time ago my father had a cancer for a number of years. I realized things were going downhill. And so I did all the things that I know you are supposed to do. You tell your father all the things that made him a special father. For the first time in my life, I really kind of thought about, well, what is it about my dad that I really appreciate? And I told him those things. And it had a very powerful effect on him when he heard from his own son all the things that I thought made him a really exceptionally good father. And so I did all of the right things. And so I thought, well, it's not going to be too hard when he dies eventually. And of course, after he died, then I did his funeral ceremony, which also was very nice, because when you do someone's funeral ceremony, they are your parent. It means that you have a chance to say a proper goodbye, to wish them well on the future journey, wherever they're going afterwards. And that was also a very, very nice thing to do. And I would recommend all of you who are monastics, and if you have a chance to do a funeral ceremony for your family members when they pass away, it is so extraordinarily powerful. And because as monastics we are in that position, we can do these things. It is very difficult for lay people to take on an entire funeral ceremony, but for monastics, actually, it is fairly straight. It's not that hard. And it's a wonderful thing to do. And it really creates a very powerful sense of closure. But my main point is that when my father died, I was watching what is happening in my mind. How did I feel about this? And what I noticed when my father died was it wasn't very difficult for me. It wasn't a very big deal. I had let go of a lot of the attachments, but there was something there. And what was there was I could feel a sense of emptiness in the world, as if something had been taken away from me, as if the world didn't feel quite as complete as it was before, as if a piece of the world was missing. That's what it felt like. And the reason, of course, when you have a parent, it was a father or mother or somebody who is very close to you, somebody you may have talked to over many, many years, someone you can go to resolve problems and issues if you have them, someone who is there to listen to you when you want to talk about something, and someone who, because you are close to them, you can talk about anything in a more relaxed way than you can do with strangers. Because of that, there is a special tie, and I realized that emptiness was because of that special tie. There was still a little bit of attachment inside of me to my father. And that was what was going on. And the moment I realized that my happiness, yeah, my meaning of life, my purpose in life, all the things that actually mattered to me, to some extent depended on the existence of my father. When my father was taken away, that emptiness was a feeling that some of the important thing in life had disappeared. It wasn't there anymore. And I understood there was still that barb of attachment in my heart that I still hadn't let go of. And when I saw that, I realized, it was very interesting, because I realized at that moment the power and the danger of attachments, and the danger of relying on some other person for your happiness, instead of being filled up inside through your kindness, through your goodness, through your metta and compassion for others, and feeling no emptiness inside. I realized that I hadn't done my job fully yet with filling myself up with good qualities, and I was relying on external things, in this case my father, for happiness, for meaning, for all of these kind of things. And when I realized that, I got this sense of aversion almost, a sense of being repelled by the idea of attachment, being repelled by the idea of relationships, especially romantic relationships, because a romantic relationship is all about, really about the idea of finding happiness through another person. That's the whole idea of a romantic relationship. And as a monk, it is very useful not to be too interested in romantic relationships, because it kind of drives you away very quickly if that is too important to you. So I found that, for me as a monk, a very, very powerful moment when I got that sense of, oh, no, I don't want to go there. What I want to do is ensure that I fill myself up inside with good qualities, so I don't have to rely on external things, whether it's people or whatever it is, for happiness, for a sense of meaning, and for what makes life worth living. And perhaps you feel that I'm being unfair, because many of you are not monastics, and maybe you feel that I'm being really harsh now by saying these things. But my point is merely that to point out that sometimes you get these insights into the nature of life, what life is about. And if you are in a relationship, it's not a problem, It's not a problem, because what you do is you understand the limits of that relationship. You understand how in some ways it gives you happiness, in some ways that is problematic. And by understanding that, you just gradually develop your spiritual path. And by developing your spiritual path, you are actually creating that independence inside of you. It happens automatically. It's part of the spiritual practice, is the building up of that kind of independence inside of you. But for me, I'm just mentioning it because it was such an interesting point when I saw this in myself. And I think it is important to share these things, because this is obviously what the Buddha has in mind to a large extent when he talks about attachments and the danger of holding on to things in the world, of not being independent, of not being filled up inside with the good qualities, so that the external world is no longer so important to you. And so that is then how we gradually overcome this. Gradually, we let go of external things, and how after a while, you actually start to feel that degree of independence inside of you. And this is such an important part of the Buddhist path. And it's, to me, one of the beautiful things of the Buddhist practice is that it actually makes you independent. You start to feel independence inside. And as I mentioned, it has very much to do with the fact that you are looking for happiness within, rather than looking for happiness without. And the more happiness you have within you, the more you have that degree of feeling fulfilled within, the less you need to rely on the external world for the happiness. And what a wonderful thing it is not to have to rely on the external world. We see the world, and sometimes you can despair at the world outside. You can despair at where humanity is driving this planet. And sometimes you feel that there's nothing much you can do about it. The people in charge don't really seem to see the seriousness of the situation. And then when you do that, it is so important to have another refuge, a refuge within, independence within, that actually enables you to find meaning somewhere else. If the world is going to the dogs, well, at least you are not going to go to the dogs. At least those people you can help in the world, they're not going to go in the wrong way. And in the end, that is where we have to find refuge. We don't know what's going to happen with the world, but we can do something about our own life. And one of the things that happens as you build up these inequalities and you build up the inner independence is that you also start to let go of your views. Yeah, why do we have so many views in this world? Why are people holding on to their views so strongly? Why is it that sometimes we are far too sure of ourselves? Yeah, when you look on the internet, sometimes people are so ridiculously sure of themselves, as if they really know what is going on, when nobody probably really knows what's going on there. But that inner happiness, actually, one of the things that it does, it enables you to be more soft about your views. Because your sense of identity is very often challenged, because views and identity go very close together. So if someone challenges your views again, we come back to this idea of identity again now that I started out with. But this is just another take on that. Our views are closely related to our sense of identity. So when someone challenges you, yeah, I don't know what you feel if someone challenges you about the reality of rebirth. Yeah, and a lot of people in the world don't really believe in rebirth. It's very easy to have that kind of conversation about whether there is rebirth or not. And personally, I don't have much doubt that there is a rebirth personally. But again, after a while, because you gain that inner independence, it means that you're not so concerned about whether other people argue about rebirth or not. You don't take that as being so much part of your identity. Yeah, your political positions, your positions about anything in the world, actually, it doesn't matter so much. And this is a beautiful thing when we don't take our views so seriously, because views are so painful so often. And you look at people in the world, and very often, if you challenge their views, it's very difficult, yeah, and it's very hard to really talk about it. If someone is very committed to believing in a creator God, for example, well, actually, it's very little you can do, because for them, that is so much part of their identity. You're not just challenging a view, you're challenging their very existence by challenging the idea of a creator God. Yeah, and that is very painful. It stops them very often from being able to make spiritual progress, because they cannot see their view for what it is, as something that perhaps they should let go of. So this is one of those great things. Yeah, we don't take our views as seriously anymore as you gain that independence inside, because you have something far more beautiful inside. And I can see that again in some of the people. It is often said that the stream winner, someone who is very close to the awakening experience itself, it is often said that the stream winner has a right view. Yeah, they're called dittipato in the sutras. Dittipato means attain to view, because they have seen reality as it actually is. But what is interesting is that even though they may be dittipato, even though they may have right view as a part of their psychology or whatever, still they don't argue about these things. They don't actually make any big deal out of it. Yeah, and this is kind of the weird thing. The more sure you are of yourself, the more confidence you have in a deep down way, the more independent you are, and the less you are able to be pushed around by the world. This is real confidence, not the superficial confidence of an ego, but a confidence that you know and understand the nature of reality. So views can also go by the wayside a little bit as you move towards this independence. Yeah. So again, it's very powerful. It allows you to evolve in your spiritual practice. Remember, everyone who is not enlightened, anyone who is not a stream enterer, has some degree of wrong view. And because you have some degree of wrong view, you should always challenge your views to some extent, to allow them to evolve according with the path towards what the Buddha is talking about ultimately here. So this is it's important. We don't hold on too much to anything in life. And but it goes even further than this. And one of the wonderful ways of thinking about the idea of dependence or independence is to think about it in the connection of free will. The free will is one of these things that is very often discussed in the world, and there are people on the one side of the equation of free will, and not the equation, one side of the argument, and some people on the other side of the argument. And I don't know if you have listened to some of the public intellectuals in the US, like Sam Harris, for example. He's on the side of there is no free will. I don't know if you've heard him talk about that. And then you have other people on the other side. But to me, the Buddhist idea of free will is actually a very different one. And I think that people like Sam Harris, they really miss the point about what free will is about. Yeah, they are talking about free will in a very superficial way. And the kind of free will that he is talking about is the kind of free will you can choose whether you want to have tea or coffee. Yeah, that is a kind of free will. Yeah, you can have tea or coffee. Actually, I have forgotten about my coffee. I have a coffee sitting right here. The idea of this coffee was to sustain me through the talk. So I'm going to have a little bit now. So you can choose tea or coffee, or you can choose tea or coffee or none of it. Yeah, none of those things. You can choose apple or oranges. You can choose this kind of relationship or that kind of relationship. This person as a friend, that person as a friend. And this is what they mean by free will, whether we have that option of choosing things freely in the world. But actually that idea of free will is very superficial, because it is a bit like, well, if you can choose an orange and an apple, well, maybe both of those are wrong. Maybe the whole idea of choosing in that realm isn't all that interesting. Yeah, if you are deluded, if you have no idea about the Buddhist path, if you have no understanding of the kind of happiness and joy you can get through meditation practice, if you have no idea of the insight that the Buddha is talking about, well, if you don't know about those things, you cannot even choose them, because you are deluded about those things. So if you cannot choose certain things, how much free will do you have? So the problem is not, whether we can choose oranges or apples. The problem is that our will is circumscribed. It is limited because we are not able to choose because of our delusion. Our entire ability to choose in the world is limited by the limits of our mental makeup, which is delusion, craving, ill will, all of these kind of things. And we choose within that very limited set of possibilities that we have, because we are deluded about the world. Our will is circumscribed, yeah? Our choice, even if you have free will, you can only choose within those things that actually are available to you. And that is so limited because of most people's understanding of life. So what we need to do, if you really want real freedom of will, what you have to do is to remove some of that delusion, remove some of the barriers to being able to choose really wisely. If you were able to choose really wisely, let's say when we did a little bit of meditation at the beginning of this session, yeah, if you were able to choose really wisely at that point, what would you do? Well, what you would do is you would enter a really nice state of samadhi just for a few minutes, yeah, bliss out for a while, get your mind really beautiful and clear. But for most people, that is not an option. It is not an option because we don't have that ability. We are too deluded. We have too many defilements of the mind to enable us even to make that choice. So free will in Buddhism is actually a very different thing. It is a freedom from constraints. It's a freedom from barriers to being able to choose what really matters. And this is what the spiritual path is really about. So if you want real independence, so you can make true choices that actually matter in the world, if you want the freedom of the will, that really is important. And don't settle for the ordinary freedom of the will that most people talk about. Settle for the freedom of the will, where the constraints are removed. And that is what happens on the spiritual path. As you practice the spiritual path, what is going on is that you are removing gradually, stage by stage, the defilements of the mind, removing the ill will, removing the excessive cravings, clearing up the mind, getting a degree of clarity, allowing the delusion, the fog, the restlessness, the doubt, all the silly defilements that are there, go with us so often, allow that to disappear. And as you do that, you emerge into clarity. And as you emerge into clarity, you're actually able to make use of that free will in a very positive way, because you can actually choose things that really do make a difference, that really do make you happy, that really do end up with overcoming suffering in this world. That is the real freedom of the will. That is what real independence is about, when you can choose what actually is very useful in life. So that is my little talk about the idea of independence in Buddhism and how it comes about. It comes about through the spiritual practice. But you have to remember, the spiritual practice is no simple thing. It takes an incredible amount of commitment and perseverance to be able to practice this path in the right way. So if you want to get these kind of results, where you gain true independence, both in the way you deal with the external world, but especially in the way you deal with the inner world, that commitment and that perseverance is really the critical issue that will make these things possible. So that is all I am going to say today. I'm going to wish all of the monastics, very nice to see all the monastics there, Venerable Ananda Bodhi and Venerable Santachit and everyone. It's wonderful to see you, and Venerable and so I wish you a very happy Rains Retreat, and Venerable Punsiri as well is up there. I wish you all a very happy Rains Retreat, and may you have lots of joy and happiness. And for all the lay people as well, may you also have a nice Rains Retreat in your own way and enjoy the next 3 months. And with the COVID situation, one of the benefits of that is that we can sometimes we have more time for ourselves and more time to meditate properly. So please enjoy that to the maximum there. Okay, take care everyone. And if you want to have some Q&A, we can take that now. Okay, so absolutely. And there's a number of things that you can do, but of course the most powerful thing very often is just to be that lack of fear that you want to see in others. Yeah, so you practice that, you find your strength through the Dhamma, you find the strength through these teachings. Come back to these things and you show it by example that it is possible. That is often the most powerful thing. Too often we would like to teach others, but really it is when we become an example to others, things become very, very powerful. That is the most important thing. And make sure you look after yourself. Make sure you get time away from people who are too fearful. So you look after your own mind and make sure that your mind is in a stable state. And then you can make something positive out of even difficult situations. But one of the things that you can say, and one of the things that I often like, one of the famous saying by Ajahn Brahm, he has a book called, I'm not sure what it is called in other places, but here in Australia it's called Good, Bad, Who Knows? And this is a story, it's a long story. I'm not going to tell the story now, but the outcome of the story is that we never know whether something in the long run is going to be for the good or for the bad of us. We just have no idea. And that is true also now with the COVID situation. I mean, for myself, when I see sometimes how people are acting in the world during COVID and how people are being more caring for each other, there's actually a lot of positive things coming out of COVID as well. Yeah, it is not all negative. This is one way people become more caring because we understand suffering in a deeper way. Another way of understanding this is, so, you basically remind people of these things that in the long run, we don't know. And a classic example is what happened after the Second World War. After the Second World War, the devastation in Europe, I can hear you're British from your accent, so you are probably part of that devastation, or your parents were, or whatever it was. And after the Second World War, one of the big outcries in Europe was never again. Yeah, there was tens of millions of people who died. There were whole cities razed to the ground. A large part of London was destroyed during the Blitz from the Germans. Yeah, it was a very, very difficult time. And yet, the time that came after the Second World War was a time of, the decades afterwards was a time of very high degree of peace and social harmony. Why? Well, because the war taught us something about the importance of not going to war. Yeah, it was a lesson. Now we are starting to forget it, and this is the problem of humanity. We always forget things, and now we are forgetting it. And of course, because we are forgetting it, who knows when we might go back to war again. So sometimes there's a big silver lining in these difficult situations. In fact, not only a silver lining, but sometimes the whole cloud is silver and there's just a little bit of a gray lining. Yeah, it's actually the inverse. silver cloud with a gray lining. And so we need to think about these things in the right way. I also remember another thing from the Second World War. There was a Norwegian, I happen to be Norwegian, so sometimes I have some insight into some aspects of Norwegian culture. This was a Norwegian man who lived through the Second World War, and he wrote a book afterwards called something like The Paradox of Happiness. And he said that people were often more happy during the Second World War than they had been beforehand, because there was a sense of comradeship, a sense of looking out for each other, doing the right thing. Yeah, it's one of those paradoxes in life. What actually is suffering and what is happiness can often be very, very hard to pin down. Anyway, so there's a couple of ideas for you right there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually. And I think rather than trying to understand everyone and trying to understand exactly where they're coming from and all these things, just to remember that we are all in this problem together. We know that we're all suffering. We know that we all have a desire to be happy, to be at peace, to live in harmony together. We have the basic inclinations of the human mind are the same, but the kind of superficial reasons why we are the way we are can be very hard to understand sometimes. So the idea of having compassion in general, without necessarily trying to empathize with everything in the world, I think that is a very important point, because otherwise you end up spending all your time trying to understand others, when actually you don't really have to understand them in such great detail, because you know that they have problems, you know they have dukkha, you know life is difficult. You have compassion. Yeah. So there you are.